I'd like to welcome you to Environmental Science, special topic on consumer transportation. And throughout this class, we're learning that our wants and our needs are definitely have a lot of impacts on the environment, particularly depending on consumer attitudes and also just a degree of development we have in our country. I became very aware of consumer transport being a truck driver, partially when I went through college, doing that for several years on and off, and also being a frequent flyer and actually being on flights that handled a lot of commercial consumer products, and then also working with the Flower Gardens Bank's National Marine Sanctuary and Advisory Board, keeping track of shipping and all the commerce that goes on over our protected coral reef in the Gulf of Mexico. So as consumers, your level of wants, because needs are pretty much basic for people, except the degree of how we spend money on our needs. For example, crops grown in America cost much more and require much more resources than we see in other countries. When we look at our wants, that means the desires we have, the luxuries. This varies dramatically, sometimes 20-fold from one culture to another or one country to another. So when we look at um, how do we get products to us, how do we get around as consumers, and what do we expect as far as the time it takes for something to get to us, requires what's called a transportation supply chain. And I want to get too into the details on this, but when we start looking at transportation, we're talking about things that require space, things that require resources, and everything associated with it. So it's not just a truck, a train, a plane, or a pipeline going somewhere, or a boat. It's we have to look at the raw materials, where they come from for the things that we desire, what's the cost of those materials. So for us, it's sometimes cheaper to get petroleum and metals and other materials that we use as raw materials from other countries and have them transported here for us to manufacture. And sometimes it's cheaper to manufacture in other countries, and that means we have to ship sometimes raw materials to those countries, and then they get manufactured somewhere else and then get transported to us as a heavy object sometimes, which requires unique transportation, particularly boats. So we have raw materials, we have the suppliers of those raw materials, because they have to accumulate these things in one place and package them. You don't just have stuff coming from a mine and directly to a manufacturer. We have the manufacturers, and sometimes they don't manufacture every part that they need. They're taking manufactured raw materials, okay, that they use. And then for manufacturing, of course, now you have the distribution. So the manufacturer is sometimes looked at as the shipper. That means they're sending stuff out, and then the distribution occurs through a carrier, which again could be trucks, airplanes, ships, um, pipelines, trains, whatever. Okay, and then we have the customer, but the customer is really what we're going to look at is the middle person. That means the shops, the stores, distribution houses that get stuff to you. Because Amazon's kind of, and the big box stores have kind of changed all that because it's localized a little where distribution goes to. But then you have to have what are called intercity distributors, which are smaller vehicles that get things from the customer that buys these products to send to the consumer. And then you as the consumer are really what makes decisions that affect this whole supply chain. So it's you, it's not companies deciding this thing. It's not manufacturers deciding this or suppliers. They're looking at your wants and needs, and basically by your buying power, and sometimes by you taking consumer surveys, or you just, how you respond to ads. So this is all a big picture that's dependent on us. So when we start looking at all of these means of getting around and doing things, this is very energy intensive, resource intensive. So when we look at modes of transportation, we have air, and today that's traditionally done with airplanes. We have water, and this is one of the oldest means of transportation. People settled around water just for this purpose, and even built waterways like airy canals and artificial lakes to be able to transport materials in areas. We tend to like being around coastlines because ships can get in. We have surface transport. which can be divided into road, which means commercial trucks, rail, and then pipeline, which, I mean, you don't see half the pipelines. You should see what a pipeline map looks like as far as how we transport natural gas, petroleum, and other materials. And then we have intermodal, which just these are intermediate transportations. Okay, and we're going to talk a little about this too, with some of the future of that. Okay, let's have a little fun here, and let's look at a map of airplanes. This is taken from an app called Flight View that I use to track flights, and not for some stalker's reason, but just to look at the percentage of cargo planes and passenger planes and just look at where things are going. And this helps me to understand the transport over protected areas, because you know, airplanes do leave pollution, and if they do have accidents and they drop stuff out, they defuel, you know, for landing, and that impacts areas around them. So guys, this I took from my app at 11 o'clock at night on a weekend. This is when traffic is light, and you can see specialty things there. Some of the planes are carrying people. Most of these, I can tell you about I'd say 3/4 of them are cargo planes, just literally traveling internationally. And these are big planes. I mean, some of these are 767s, Airbuses, and that, don't worry about. That's actually a special type of aircraft called the balloon, Project Loon, and that is actually sending Wi-Fi to rural areas and areas that have been damaged by storms, so people have that. But that also is kind of an air commerce that takes up airspace. So literally our skies are crowded. And on the app, I couldn't show you the whole world, but it's amazing the density of planes in some areas just literally cover the map. Now, of course, the planes are not that big, but it still gives you an idea. This is the slowest time. If I was to show you the rush hour of aircraft, it would be covered. And again, most of this will be commerce, and even commercial planes. If you're taking a trip, let's say, you know, your holiday back from Puerto Rico to going to Houston, there's commerce on that plane too. That's why they charge you for luggage. Sometimes the planes need that space for commerce. So we see a lot of airspace taken up by, and all the pollution that these planes produce is unimaginable. Next favorite app is marine transport, because I'm interested in that. Because what I'm looking at here with marine transport is the Gulf of Mexico, because I look at the ships and different types of ships that go over to protected areas that I'm interested in and serve on a national committee with. So all these dots are ships. I'd say 90% of them are ships moving commerce. I'd say about 50% of that is petrol of some type, in some form, either refined or crude oil. So look at this, and look, I mean, you look at the coast of Africa, every coastline, and look at the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I've been out on the Gulf of Mexico in the deep parts, and I've been out on open seas here doing research, and you run into ships all the time. Now, of course, the ships are not this big like the dots, but some of these dots or even you see some ships that act like oil platforms too, particularly off of the Gulf of Mexico and off of Peru and Brazil, where there are huge reserves right now of oil. So this is amazing. You look at the Middle East, around India, this is a big manufacturing area, shipping and export, and this is amazing. But these ships, they carry ballast. That means that they suck in water to raise and lower their level, so they sit at a certain level in the sea so they don't overturn. I mean, you can take some of these big ships in full hurricanes, and if they can ballast it right, but that means they have to suck in water. And a lot of ships will suck in water, let's say here, and transport that water here, and then release that water, because that's just what they do. They try to adjust the level of the ship, and it goes back and forth. And that can transport pollution, it can transport invasive species. But these ships also, some of them leak oil, and some of the tankers have accidents. We've had several major accidents recently, particularly around the country of Mauritius, right off the coast of Africa, where, I mean, it created a horrible spill. And we've had some in Honduras and other areas. We have some in our own region. So you have to think about also the fuel that goes into these ships. Even though it is the most efficient way to transport stuff, you sometimes can't get stuff here. Okay, maybe through some of the major rivers, but I don't even have this blown up so you can see all the river vessels too. So you'd see literally the Mississippi River is covered. It's just that you don't I don't have the full resolution set on this map. Now, this transportation map is one of my favorites because when I was in college, I drove big trucks and, to mostly transport furniture, but that's a consumer thing in itself. But also sometimes I transported, commercial products, mostly in the corridor around here. Okay, but occasionally my driving took me further around. So this is called a commercial truck density map, and you could see what we call there's the main lines, okay, and this is usually what we call over the road that goes cross country, and then you have the collaterals, which are usually interurban between cities, and then sometimes within cities, and they don't show the within city ones because the map would be totally whatever color this is, reddish orange. So, and look at some areas here, they have no roads. Okay, I mean, the roads, it's almost Canada when you get into Maine. And you can also see, just basically the population densities and where the traffic goes in. So when you look at rural areas, it takes a lot of little trucks to sometimes get into those areas. And the darker is where you usually see the big trucks. But guys, this is a lot of wear and tear on highways. It's a lot of local, low, atmospheric pollution that's very low to the ground. People that live near these areas tend to be impacted by that pollution. And it's also noise pollution. Now it's a little better. When I was driving early on, we used to use what's called jake braking or engine braking, which is sometimes used. And that was very noisy, particularly in urban areas. I mean, you can hear me from 4 miles away when I was sometimes stopping that truck. Okay, so again, think of the resources that go into this, the materials that go into the trucks, and all of that is amazing. And this shows a major pipeline map, and we mean major. So again, we're looking at gas transmission. That means natural gas, because this is stuff that's dangerous to drive in trucks. I did have a hazmat license for hazardous materials, but the most I handled was radioactive stuff, which is not that great, but it doesn't really blow up in the amounts I was hauling. And this is hazardous liquids. That means petrol and stuff like that. It is considered a hazardous material, and we prefer not to have those in trucks. So we put them on the ground. And look at Texas. So this is stuff sometimes entering these areas, leaving these areas. And you can even see some actually go through waterways, which becomes very tricky, particularly since we have fishing going on and other things going on, and these things have a possibility of leaking. So you should see this, I mean, for around the world. Now, we probably tend to have a higher density of pipelines than other countries, but it's still, you see maps very much like this. And you could be living right next to one. I know I am. I'm living near a major pipe that we have little flags hanging out of the ground and other things that say don't dig here, don't drop a bomb here, or whatever. And they even have cameras up there to watch to make sure that you don't tamper with the pipelines. I know in parts of Mexico, people will tap into these above ground pipelines trying to siphon off gas, and they end up dying doing it sometimes, or else leaving behind leaks because they don't seal the tubes. And guys, and these are done by people that are desperate, not people that are trying to resell the stuff a lot of the times. And last but not least, and this is something I never thought about when I look at this map. This is a map of satellites at this point in time, which is about 20,000. And we have what we call near-Earth satellites. I'll do this in yellow. Near-Earth satellites. And then we have outer orbital satellites. And look at the orbit. These are all in very precise orbits. So guys, what does this have to do with transportation? That's not a satellite, that's a planet, probably. So what does this have to do with transportation? These satellites are needed for GPS, they're needed for communication. I know ship to shore requires satellites, and boy, they pay a pretty penny for those. I think it was $100 a day to one time I wanted to use ship to shore when I had no cell or other types of signals available, or Wi-Fi. So this is amazing. And guys, as transportation increases and communication increases, and we want faster communications, more dots have to go up here. So most of these are communication satellites, and things like LiDAR, which is used a lot in GPS and map building. So it's amazing. And if you were to look at 1950, nothing was up here, and now our skies are crowded, literally to the point that there's upper atmosphere dust that comes down all the time, and these suckers have to be sent up all the time. My youngest brother was a VP at Lockheed Martin, and he helped to send up lots of satellites from different countries and helped to design the propulsion computer systems to get these up there and working, including the Hubble and things like that. But NASA has very few things up here. This is mostly commercial stuff that is now going to be more and more set up by commercial entities that are basically replacing the role of NASA. And this last slide is something that I kind of like and I find kind of fun because I've gotten to meet astronauts and Elon Musk and other big people that I thought I'd never ever see again, and work with people that you see in the news all the time. And this is your future. I mean, it's going on now, so it's not really a future, and this will get more and more. And this is looking at how transportation is moving more towards high speed, what we call suborbital or supersonic flight, upper atmosphere transportation. So we are right now looking at, as a society, of using spacecraft that are going to look like airplanes, and sometimes they look like canisters, flying canisters, like R2-D2 or something like that from Star Wars. So we're talking about doing people, sometimes for recreation, sometimes mostly for business because they like to pay the big bucks, but mostly cargo. So we are looking at commercial spaceflight as a way of shipping stuff. It already is part of the supply chain. And there are some big players in here that are doing this. So this is going to be part of the supply chain. And we have different ways we can use rockets. Don't worry about the ballistic. That's for war and why they send them up that high so they're not shut down and they can do a nice fast trip and get to where they're going. But what we're looking at is periodic, which means this is suborbital. That means we send a ship up. And again, these are going to look more like airplanes or containers. And the thing takes a little trip slowly down because we don't keep it going to stay in orbit, and we're not really high enough to keep it really in a good orbit. Okay, and then it travels at a very high speed from point A to point B. And we also have high-speed jets that really are nothing new, these supersonic jets. They used to be used for transporting people between New York and Paris at one time. Air France used to fly these, but they proved to be too expensive and not effective, and no one wanted to pay the price. But now there are people willing to pay the price to get really quickly across continents. But guys, it's amazing now when we look at commercial space flight. My concern are the fuels and what happens if there's an accident. And some of these particularly will use sometimes little nuclear generators, and some of the materials require radioactive materials on these ships, and a lot of materials that I don't want to see crashing into the ocean or into the environment. Now, the fuels that are coming out are usually a little safer because they're cheaper and safer not only on the environment but on the people operating these things, and half of these things won't even operate by a person. They'll be robotic. I mean, it's not worth the cost when you can have a robot flying these things and doing a darn good job and not make many mistakes. But this is going to be amazing. I know companies like Amazon, who have a great supply chain, they're working with commercial spaceflight industries that have these rockets and centers that have space stations like Houston. I mean, there's one off of Alaska. I know the guy that runs that one. And so various areas actually make money being a host to spaceflight, either vertical or these ones that take off horizontally like airplanes. And I mean, I heard of a scenario that was being talked about by people from SpaceX, that if someone in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa needs a particular vaccine, or they need an antibiotic that they don't have anywhere in the country and they can't afford to get it from anywhere near them, you could have it literally flown out from, New York and get there literally within a couple, hours, maybe even, a shorter period of time. But it's amazing. Or we could use, these things to interconnect resources by taking a flight from here to there or whatever. And by knowing the supply chain, that means supply and demand, and being able to streamline it. This is amazing. So you're going to see more of this for particularly critical materials, and particularly in use for humanitarian use when it comes to getting something that's really fragile or really readily needed in no time, and it's not available in one spot. So yes, right now there's a high cost to this, but not the cost that we used to see. And this is going to start getting less and less expensive as these flights occur, and it's going to be a lot of times used for high-end stuff in which time is important. So what I want you to do is think about your consumer habits. what are your needs and what are your wants? Now, your needs, a culture does have differences in needs and how much money we put into moving around and growing our foods or making our products that we need or living in a house. But it's the wants that really get us. I want something quickly, this and that. I know when I order on Amazon, I like next day delivery, especially if it's something I really want to have within a particular time. So just think about it and think about all that's involved in this. Transportation. So everything you buy has an incredible history of how it got to you and might have gone through every form of transportation to get each part of that thing to you.